Responses to the Russia-Ukraine war. This is meant to be a roundtable, so we hope we will have plenty of discussion. My name's Olda Bureš. I'm the head of the Center for Security Studies here at Metropolitan University Prague. The Center for Security Studies, along with the International Relations and European Studies Department, IRES, and the Journal of Central European and International Security Studies, CEJISS, are the co-organizers of this event. I have to apologize or excuse that Dr. Aleš Karmazin from CEJISS cannot be here today because he is ill. Maybe he is online, so Aleš, if you are there, I hope you are feeling better. And I'm sure we will see each other at future events in person. The idea behind this event is that a couple of weeks ago there was an event on general discussion about the war in Ukraine in Czech perspectives, basically from a colleague who is specializing on Russia, former post-Soviet space, Dr. Romancov, and economist Dr. Sedláček, and Aleš Karmazin. Which was highly successful, and we felt that it would be good to complement it with what we consider the national and regional perspectives. So what different states and regions or countries in different regions have done vis-a-vis the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And essentially we want to highlight the differences and similarities. And the idea was that we will take advantage of the great colleagues that we have at MUP, at different departments and centers, who are coming from different countries, so they are the best experts on the national perspective. So we have to my right Associate Professor Braun, who will cover especially his home country Sweden, but also agree to cover or say something about the other Nordic countries. Even more to the right from my side is Dr. Ricardo Reboredo, who is going to cover the US, his native country, and also something on the North Atlantic geopolitics, so on that regional perspective. To my left we have Dr. Christine Andreeva, who will cover her native Bulgaria. And we have Marko Stojić, who will cover his native Serbia and the Balkans. Maybe Christine will also say something more on the neighboring countries. I don't know, no pressure. I've asked, when organizing this event, all four speakers to basically start the discussion with their thoughts, views, comments on 3 sets of questions. In no particular order, some of them may emphasize some of the questions more than the others, but basically to get us started. The first question I posed is, what has been your home or native country response to the conflict in Ukraine, both in terms of words and deeds? The second question, public policy perceptions of the war in Ukraine and the responses of the country that you are covering to it. And finally, any personal thoughts on the previous question or the war in Ukraine itself. So basically anything that our distinguished colleagues would like to share about the policy perspective, public opinion, or the conflict as such. So without further ado, I will pass the floor. We will go, I suggest, in the order as it's listed in the program. So I will pass the floor to Mets in a minute. Just in terms of the organization, there are some people here in the room after the initial remarks, which I asked all speakers to keep within roughly 10-12 minutes. We will open it up to your questions and discussion. Those of you who are here, we will be passing around the microphone. Those of you who are online, please use the chat function. This is because of the recording, and opening the mic to everybody online sometimes makes it complicated, but we do hope to engage also those of you who are online. Thank you for joining online. Please type in any questions, comments to the chat function. We will try to collect them and also make sure that these get covered and answered. So hopefully I haven't forgotten anything in my initial remarks, and without further ado, I will pass the microphone to Mets.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event today. So I will try to speak a little bit about the Nordic countries. I will perhaps focus a little bit the same amount of attention, I hope, to almost all of the countries. To start with, the reactions have been quite similar. I mean, there have been strong condemnation of the Russian aggressions in Ukraine. And all countries have contributed with delivering or exporting military equipment to Ukraine, with the exception of Iceland. And for quite natural reasons, Iceland does not have a standing army. So for that reason, that has been quite an obvious thing. What is perhaps the most interesting aspect when you look at the Nordic countries and the war in Ukraine is that it has started debate about the country's own position when it comes to their foreign policy orientation, when it comes to their security orientation. If we go through the different countries, maybe you know that of the 5 Nordic countries that we normally speak of, 3 of them are members of NATO, 2 are not. 3 of them are members of the European Union, 2 are not. And it's not the same countries being members of these 2 different organizations, obviously. So if we start by looking towards Norway, Norway is a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but it's not a member of the European Union. And in Norway, the Ukraine war actually has led to the beginning, at least, of a debate on the European Union membership. Well, why so? Well, the sanctions imposed by the European Union on Russia was discussed on a meeting, a European Council meeting, where Norway was only present as being observers, agreeing to be a part of these sanctions, but not actually being part of the negotiations on them. Meaning that in the Norwegian case, the whole issue has highlighted the discussion about can Norway remain outside of the European Union, or is there an added value of entering the European Union as a consequence of this war? If we go to Denmark, Denmark is the country which is both a member of North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. But in Denmark, the discussion has been about the common security and defense policy of the European Union, because there Denmark opted out in the past as a consequence of the Maastricht Treaty. And thus the Danish debate has been about maybe it's necessary to opt in again from that and basically cancel the exception for that part of the Maastricht Treaty, or part of the EU's treaty base. So basically the discussion is for Denmark to be able to take part in EU military operations, but also in developing military equipment based on EU level. Denmark has to be a part of this. So there will be a referendum on this in Denmark on the 1st of June. The most heated debate probably is in Finland about NATO membership. As you know, Finland has a long border to Russia, approximately 1,300 kilometers long border with Russia. And the question is here if Finland should join NATO as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. And here we can expect some information already on Wednesday this week. And it's likely that Finland will take the step to apply for NATO membership. And the discussion is basically about what happens then. Isn't that a situation where you put yourself at risk when you declare that you will enter this organization, but before you actually enter the organization? So there's a lot of discussion about how to time this, how will you actually deal with the interim period before actually becoming a member. Then we have finally my native country, Sweden, where Sweden is a member of the European Union, but is not a member of NATO. And here you basically have also discussion about NATO, but not the same debate as in Finland. In Sweden, the debate is on a quite political level, and we can expect that it will take much longer before a decision is taken. And basically you have a bit of an approach that you can expect that Finland can enter NATO without Sweden entering NATO. The Swedes would be fine to be the only country in the region not entering NATO, whereas the opposite is not really possible due to the geographic position of Finland and also due to the Finnish experience of war with the Soviet Union in 1939, the so-called Winter War, basically experience of being attacked by the Soviet Union. So you have much more concern in Finland about the actual security of the country, whereas this discussion in Sweden is more, okay, but if Sweden becomes a member of NATO, does that actually help Ukraine? Probably not. So it's more kind of focusing on external issues than actually on the security of their own country. So there you have kind of a difference in the way the issue is discussed. But in many ways, to get back to the starting point, the responses are very similar. The responses are being very much of one of condemnation, of being very upset about the Russian war in Ukraine, and about being very much in favor of imposing sanctions on Russia, even going into the stop of importing oil and gas, even if it has not, but you have at least a popular support in many of the countries from going in that direction as well. I think I will stop there from now as an introduction, and we're happy to get back to other issues in the discussion later on. Thank you.
So we will proceed to Ricardo. So Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you everybody. So I want to keep these remarks fairly brief, and I'm going to focus on three main issues. The first one is the Biden administration's sort of the nature of their support. The second one is U.S. public opinion and how this in turn feeds into processes of kind of politicization within the country. And then I'll talk about the future, because the U.S. has a midterm election coming up in November, and then the presidential election coming up in 2 years after that. And there's a kind of wild card element. I'm sure you all know who he is, who I'm talking about here. Now, in terms of the Biden administration, I think the best way to characterize their support for Ukraine is support within certain limits. They would call it probably support within reason. So the best way to really think about this is Antony Blinken's recent quote where he says, "In this time of uncertainty, we have a clear way forward. Help Ukraine defend itself, support the Ukrainian people, hold Russia accountable." Everything within the administration is based on these three sort of facets. Now, Biden has been a little bit more upfront. He's more of a shoot-from-the-hip kind of guy. He, at times to the chagrin of our allies, of the U.S.'s allies in Europe. For instance, he recently called Putin a war criminal. He said he should be tried in international court. A couple of weeks ago, he went off script and he talked about how, I think the exact phrase was, "Dear God, he cannot remain in power," which sent White House staff kind of scrambling to be like, no, we're not talking about regime change. This was just Joe kind of going off script. But in essence, what we have here is this limited support. So what does this look like? Well, first and foremost, the U.S. is not going to get involved directly. The administration has made this very clear. So they're also not going to push the Russians beyond a certain point. Now, the administration, for the most part, believes that any sort of direct U.S.-Russia confrontation may go nuclear quite quickly, and they want to do everything they can to avoid that. They see World War III, the seeds of World War III in this Ukrainian conflict. So the U.S.'s support is essentially for Ukraine and getting out of the way. And this manifested, interestingly, quite early on with the whole no-fly zone situation. That was a fairly popular call in the early parts of the war, where NATO would close down the skies, as they said. But for the most part, the administration was very clear this is not a possible policy option. Now, instead what they do is they essentially spare no expense at supporting the Ukrainians with weapons and with humanitarian aid. So the U.S. has currently sent $1.7 billion worth of military equipment to the Ukrainians. This includes 5,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles, 7,000 small arms, 45,000 rounds of ammo, a lot of body armor and helmets, and so on. In total, about $2.5 billion of aid has been sent. So that's including humanitarian aid as well. And recently, actually a couple days ago, the U.S. Senate passed what's called the Ukrainian Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022. Now, if Lend-Lease sounds familiar, it's because this was the program that was used in World War II, and they're sort of bringing it back. Now, this hasn't passed the House yet because they're on break for the next couple of weeks, but it's expected to go through, and this is going to cut red tape, if you will, and lead to more American supplies going into Ukraine. Now, with regard to U.S. public opinion, we can basically summarize it in this fashion. The U.S. is largely and America's a very big country, so there's always people with different opinions. But for the most part, Americans are happy to support Ukraine, but they're divided in how the administration is doing, which again, you have to talk about the kind of nature of the US political system right now and how sort of bifurcated it is. So 77% of Americans say that sanctions on Russia should be maintained. And interestingly enough, now you have upwards of 70% of Americans seeing Russia as an enemy of the United States. Whereas in January, this was down around 35-40%. Okay, so it has shifted American popular views on foreign policy more broadly. Now, about half of Americans approve of the Biden administration's handling of the invasion, but 40% say disapprove, so very much down the middle there. And interestingly enough, when you look at these kind of polls on how Americans feel about Ukraine, it's very much divided. It's on a bipartisan basis. Okay, so this is an area, and one of the few areas, I have to say, where there is bipartisan support. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here is that 70% say that the U.S. should not engage the Russians militarily, whereas 30% say that they should, even if this risks nuclear war. So the vast majority of Americans support the idea that there is aid within reason, within a sort of limited scope. Okay, they do not want to get involved in a war with Russia. Now, regarding the politics of this whole thing, the U.S. had midterm elections in November. Just for myself, kind of looking at how this is going to play out, even if the Republicans win the House or the Senate, which is likely to happen, one or the other, if not both, I don't think too much will change regarding the U.S.'s broad sort of support for the Ukrainians. I think perhaps the support will be politicized a bit further. Perhaps it'll be leveraged by the Republicans to kind of get what they want. Mitch McConnell recently said that if they were to win either the House or the Senate, he would turn Joe Biden into a moderate. And the way to do that is by leveraging different sort of policy instruments. So that's sort of way in which things could change, but to be quite honest, I don't think it's going to have too much effect. Now, the wild card comes in 2024. So if Trump wins again, it's hard to say what's going to happen. So let's just kind of repeat what we know about Trump, NATO, Ukraine, Russia. Trump has been very, very critical of NATO. In fact, his former national security advisor, John Bolton, recently said that he would have pulled the U.S. out of NATO entirely in a second term. Now, that might just be Bolton talking, but there are signs that he was looking to move in that direction. He calls it unfair to the U.S. He says the alliance is obsolete and such and so on. Now, with regards to Putin, I think Trump has a very sort of special relationship there, as we saw in the Helsinki meeting a few years back, where he essentially said, no, the Russians did not interfere in the U.S. election, despite the fact that 17 different American intelligence agencies had said that, yes, they did, to lesser or greater sort of degrees. He instead took Putin's word for it and said, no, of course they didn't. Now, with regards to Trump and Ukraine, let's not forget that he was impeached for withholding $400 million of congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine in this kind of scheme to have President Zelensky investigate Joe Biden's son, Hunter. And he also over and over again dismissed Ukraine as a sort of corrupt country that wasn't worth American efforts. So what happens if he returns to power? To be honest, I don't think anyone knows. I think a second Trump administration will be very different from the first. I think he will be much less tied to existing policy. And because of this, and because of the kind of just impossibility of knowing what will happen with U.S. politics over the next couple of years, I think if I were a European ally, I would look at the U.S. as a supportive, but ultimately unreliable sort of partner, especially looking in the medium term. And so I'll probably just stop there.
So now if I may ask Marko. We are following the order as it's listed in the program. So.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk today briefly about Serbia first, and maybe later we will have time to talk about other Balkan states. Serbia is obviously a very interesting state in Europe because it's probably one of the most pro-Russian states in Europe after Belarus, the single most pro-Russian state in Europe in many respects. So it's been traditional ally of Russia in the Western Balkans, and it has one of the most pro-Russian publics in Europe. Yet it has been performing very delicate balancing act, making gestures towards the West and towards the East since the start of the crisis, because it did not impose sanctions on Russia and refused to do so, but at the same time it voted twice against Russia or Russian interest at the United Nations, and also it formally supports Ukrainian territorial integrity. So it is the only country which has not imposed any sanctions against Russia in Europe, except Belarus. And it is important to understand a bit wider context of why that happened, and a bit about domestic politics in Serbia. So basically the country is led by its increasingly authoritarian president, Aleksandar Vučić. He is a typical post-Balkan, post-communist strongman, autocrat, you know, assuming almost complete control of the country, including the media, state institution, judiciary. And generally, the country experienced significant democratic backsliding over the last 10 years, actually since 2012, when he became involved in politics first as the deputy prime minister. So he is in charge here. He is the one making the decision whether to impose or not to impose sanctions. He is a former ultra-nationalist member and one of the leaders of the Serbian Radical Party. But at the same time, he's also a strategically driven opportunist. So he's somebody who is also strategically driven and very much supported by the public. Actually, a few days ago, we had elections, and he won 58.5% of votes. So there will be no second round of elections. So in his victory speech, he said that he planned to maintain friendly and partnership relations with Russia, and he said also that Serbia would stick to its balancing act between its EU membership bid and its close links with Russia and China. So the problem here is that Serbia has been under strong pressure, especially from the European Union, to choose between its historical ally Russia and aspirations to join the European Union. At the same time, it's important to know that actually negotiations on its future membership have largely stalled. There is no prospect of joining the EU anytime soon, definitely not before 2025. That was set as a sort of deadline by the Commission a few years ago. So this is not going to happen definitely by 2025. The country has opened only 22 out of 35 negotiating chapters, closed preliminary 2, and it has not opened a single chapter between December 2019 and December 2021. So obviously there is not much going on in this respect. Nevertheless, the EU expects Serbia to align itself with sanctions against Russia or to impose similar measures, saying that things like, I will quote here the Commissioner spokesperson, "Our partners in Serbia are aware of the importance of this issue for us. The EU will be taking very important decisions for Serbia based on its commitment to the values and principles. And currently, Serbian harmonization with the EU foreign policy is only 56%, meaning that's the lowest in the Western Balkans." So why it did not impose a sanction? A number of reasons, political, economic reasons, also because of the fact that the public is very pro-Russian. So during the electoral campaign, it was obviously impossible for him to say, yeah, I'm going to impose sanctions because of the electoral concerns. And also there has been generally very traditional Russophilian country, both in the public and also when it comes to the political elites. So as I said earlier, Serbia has always been a traditional ally of Russia in the Balkans. Both nations of Slavic belong to Slavic groups of nations. They share Eastern Christian Orthodoxy as the same religion. Russia has always been a sort of protector throughout the history of Serbian interest and its fight against the Ottomans, Austrians, Hungarians. Red Army was the army which liberated partly former Yugoslavia after the Second World War, And both the Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, they had quite good relations, except during when President in the 40s and 50s under Stalin. But in principle, they had quite good relations. And what happened in the 1990s actually is that Russia largely had a pro-Serb view throughout the 1990s when it comes to the war in former Yugoslavia. And they experienced a very similar recent history, actually. That makes them quite similar, and even generated even more pro-Russian sentiments in this country. First, there is a clear sort of parallel that can be drawn between Serbia and Russia as the biggest nations in both, respectively, Soviet Union and the former Yugoslav Federation, in both federal states. After the collapse of both states, millions of Russians remained in post-Soviet states outside of Russia, as well as hundreds of thousands of Serbs remaining in Bosnia, in Montenegro, Croatia, and some other states. So there was a very similar role that both nations played in both federal states, and also the same way they've been treated by the West, not understanding their more or less legitimate concerns for their compatriots that found themselves outside of their states of Serbia and Russia. And recently, this now very very visibly ominous concept of Russian world strongly echoed in Serbia as well, promoted by some politicians, even the members of the current cabinet, including the Minister of Interior, saying that creating Serb world is a task of this generation of politicians. So you can see there is a clear parallel between two nations in a way how they perceive their roles in the past, and also now when they find many of their compatriots actually not living anymore within the borders of these states. So these pro-Russian sentiments are coupled with strong anti-Western sentiments, anti-EU and anti-US, primarily NATO, and then anti-EU sentiments as well, mostly due to the perception that the West supported all Serbian enemies during the war. It was not, especially because of the 1990 NATO aggression against Serbia, that left very deep scars on the Serbian public, making Serbian people extremely negative towards joining the NATO. And NATO, I mean, this is interesting discussion going on in Sweden and Poland and Finland. Certainly is not happening in Serbia, because there is a kind of widespread perception that it will never join NATO. Russia, of course, opposed the NATO war against Serbia, so it contributed further to this cultural, historical, political closeness that existed even before between the two nations. Second crucial reason why Serbia doesn't want to impose sanctions is the crucial role played by Russia when it comes to the issue of Kosovo, that you are probably familiar with. So it is a strategic partner for Serbia in defending its territorial integrity in Kosovo. Russia doesn't recognize Kosovo as an independent state, and did not recognize its independence when it was unilaterally declared in 2008. It holds a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, so actually it can block Kosovo from joining the EU, which is ultimately the goal of Kosovo, along with China. But Russia is key supporter. So as Serbia is not ready to give up Kosovo, which has been de facto an independent state sponsored by NATO and created by the Western allies since 1999, this is crucial reason not to upset Russia, because potentially what may happen is that Russia simply abstain in eventual bid of Kosovo to join the United Nations. That would be the final step towards its full independence, actually. Number three, it relies heavily on energy, on Russia. So this is something which is similar to other countries, unlike the issue of Kosovo. So almost entirely depending on Russian gas. And it receives actually gas at a very discount price. So, for example, I have some numbers. It pays only $260 for 1,000 cubic meters of gas. So there is this kind of brotherly price, but valid I think until the end of May, and only up to the level of 6 million cubic meters per day. Above that, Serbia pays market prices. It produces only 10% of gas it needs. When it comes to the crude oil, it is also imported 73% from the outside, and 33% of that is imported from Russia. Even gas produced within the country is produced by, it's in the hands of Russia, because it's produced by the Serbian oil industry, which had been sold to Gazprom Neft, which is now a majority shareholder of oil industry of Serbia. So another reason to be against imposing sanctions. And Kremlin is actually decided not to force Serbia to pay gas in ruble, because it does not consider Serbia as unfriendly state. So the spokesman, Kremlin spokesman, said recently, Serbia's concern in this respect will be our priority. Number three, I mentioned earlier, general elections. So we had elections on the 3rd of April this year, and because of concerns electoral concerns, obviously, Vučić was very much aware of the fact that there is a pro-Russian public, pro-Russian voters. That strong anti-Western sentiments that can be traced back to 1999 and generally in the 1990s. So most of people perceive Ukraine as an instrument of West against Russia. He's obviously very much aware of that, and he did not express during the campaign overly pro-Russian rhetoric. He presented himself as the source of stability, somebody who is, the big father of the nation, taking care of everything and everyone, from gas prices to the quantity of powder milk and peas, for example. I mean, it's typical narrative triggered by the context of the war in Ukraine, claiming change is danger, so vote for me. I'm the father of nation. I'm going to take care of you. So, but not overly pro-Russian. At the same time, many other parties have been pro-Russian, and those who actually had this extremely strong pro-Russian narrative, they profited. So for the first time now, we have a significant number of MPs which are radical right, pro-Russian, anti-European, quite hard Eurosceptic, that managed to enter the parliament a few days ago, mostly due to the conflict in Russia that totally changed the dynamics of the electoral campaign in Serbia. However, the media is also very pro-Russian, but the media is under direct influence on Vučić. So the media outlets have pushed very much one-sided, very positive narratives around Russia, glorifying Vladimir Putin. Especially the press is quite a nationalist, pro-Russian, generally anti-European and anti-Western. They act as a mouthpiece of the Serbian Progressive Party, so that they crucially contributed to this pro-Russian sentiments in the country, with very few independent media providing a relatively balanced coverage of what's happening in Ukraine. And so on the other side, what I want to say now in the first round of this discussion, Serbia seems to be now, after the election, generally or gradually might be moving away from Russia. So there are widespread speculation that there is a shift now taking place, gradual shift. Nobody knows whether this is really happening or this is just kind of tactical movement by Vučić, but there are a couple of things that happened over the last couple of days, actually, and weeks, especially after the election. For the first time, Serbia joined the EU restrictive measures regarding the situation in Ukraine since 2014. So it aligned itself with one measure of the Council. It was a decision extending the restrictive measures against former President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and the members of the Ukrainian government from 2010-2014. So this is very symbolic measure, obviously. This is something that is not directly against Russia, so it was very easy to swallow for the domestic public, not really relevant, and a kind of symbolic way to appease the West and the EU. But two more important also events happened. The first one was the fact that Serbia backed UN resolution condemning Russian attack on Ukraine and asking Russia to immediately withdraw from Ukraine. That was quite a big surprise. This was quite a relatively hostile reaction, but there was no hostile kind of reaction from Moscow coming after this. Explanation for this decision was there were two. First, that this resolution did not cross the red line, so the text didn't talk about sanctions, so it didn't mention any sanctions. But at the same time, it is important, that's the view of the government, to condemn attack on the territorial integrity of an EU member, an UN member state, which is obviously clear reference to Kosovo and to Serbia being attacked by NATO in 1999. So Serbian ambassador said, Serbia is committed to observing the principle of territorial integrity and political independence of states. West, of course, the West welcomed this, but apparently EU ambassadors had previously informed Belgrade that the UN vote would strongly impact its European integration. And one more voting that happened last Thursday, Serbia voted to suspend Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council. And here the narrative was a bit different. This was more dramatic, actually. So Vučić claimed that Serbia did that under clear duress. So it was blackmailed. It faced threat, I'm quoting here, of sanctions and increasing pressure. The initial decision was to abstain. Many states actually abstain. But Vučić said, if we abstain, other countries will go against us and pressure will increase. What happened is that the EU actually was supposed to make a decision whether to exempt all Serbian oil industry from the EU package of sanctions on oil, Russian oil, because this company is owned by Gazprom Neft. So what they did is they postponed the decision until 6 o'clock on Thursday to see what's going to happen at 4 o'clock, how Serbia is going to vote. And the following day, actually, the decision was made that Gazprom Neft and Serbian oil industry will be exempted from this package of sanctions, meaning Serbia would be able to buy still gas and oil abroad, so there will be no sanctions imposed of them. Interestingly, Russia accepted this, saying we understand that. Dmitry Peskov saying that this was a result of the coercion, that many friendly countries voted for the exclusion of Russia from this institution. It's a result of the coercion, of Russophobia, and he literally said, we understand that. So for now, it seems there have been no consequences. So it's actually a sort of million-dollar question: to what extent Serbia will be moving towards the West? For Vučić, that's going to be very difficult now, because in the parliament he has a number of pro-Russian, far-right, right-wing MPs and parties. They all immediately attacked him, accused him of betraying Russia, warning that there is no longer any obstacle for the final betrayal of Kosovo. The other party said this confirmed that the policy of military neutrality advocated in public by Vučić is just on paper, because the vote against our greatest ally, Russia, is proof that the state leadership is implementing a policy of indirect integration into NATO. So I will later add something about say something about the Serbian public opinion. I have some data from Friday, actually, and what they think about the war. So maybe we can discuss that later.
Much appreciated. The Serbian perspective is certainly unique, at least in the European context. And last but not least, we'll move to Bulgaria. So, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Perhaps it's fitting I'm sitting in the middle, because Bulgaria sort of represents a middle between this Western-shaped common perception and opinion and this Russian, Eastern-leaning, with the remnants of the past and history that they share together point of view. I'll start by saying that Bulgaria and Hungary are the only two NATO countries that have not agreed to send military or industrial aid to Ukraine. So this is the embarrassing starting point that I go from. And in my view, there are sort of three strategic reasons for this. The first I'll start with is the first is the political situation. The second is the public opinion, which sort of draws on what Marko said about the ties that are there, the pro-Russian population, or in Bulgaria it's sort of split, so it's a little bit of a hybrid. Part of the population pulls towards EU-NATO views, the other is still remnants of the past and the past communist shared history. And the third is just several specific incidents that are sort of in the news right now that confuse further the situation. So, as a political background, Bulgaria was in a bit of a political crisis in the past year, specifically in 2021. We had 3 snap elections within 1 year because practically there is some sort of an upheaval or wannabe revolution that occurred against the corrupt long-term government of the belonging to the EPP families or the center-right. And as it was finally sort of ousted and is being prosecuted for various corruption cases, it opened the public opinion, the political space for a lot of new parties to come in. So practically after each of these 3 snap elections that took place within the height of the pandemic, new parties were being formed and pushing their way into political life. So this caused a true political confusion and even I would call it crisis, because at the end of the year, before the holidays, with budget to be adopted and COVID measures to be adopted, there was still no government after more than 9 months of elections. So this caused a bit of an upheaval where it wasn't clear where Bulgaria stands anymore politically. And this resulted also in the current sort of it's so-called four-way coalition, which includes 2 populist protest parties that were formed in this period that are very confused about their identity and position on the spectrum. The Bulgarian Socialist Party, that is very strongly pro-Russian with financial ties as well to Russia, and as well a reformist party that has been there for a while, but 3 of these parties have never been in government. One of them has barely been in parliament, so they're very inexperienced in that sense, and now they're learning to work together, which results as a very confusing and inactive government, because on any issue internally and by now externally, you can tell that there's a lacking position on any important issue, because if anyone agrees within the coalition, it's 2 by 2 different parties, but usually not the 4 of them at the same time, and this is just not enough for majority in parliament. So this is as a brief overview of what's happening, because this is at least the formal reason why there is no decision made yet. There's been a lot of pressure from various parties, not political parties, but various sides in this debate. And as of Friday, there is a draft proposal for a resolution introduced in the Bulgarian parliament for one of the coalition partners, which is waiting for vote this week. It will probably be tied up somehow with other internal issues going on currently. Several of the parties are with unclear positions, so I've tried to look into it to see if there's a possibility for any sort of compromise on this vote, and it seems unclear. But what's even more interesting to me there is that it's still unclear whether, because the parliament could not really oblige the government to agree on military assistance, So the interesting thing is that the government itself might still not act, even if the parliament resolution passes, because I found quite a bit of disagreement between even the defense minister and the deputy defense minister on whether this should be done. One of the reasons is so let me switch to public opinion for a moment, because I find this very interesting, and I'll tie this up to the defense argument. But I was curious to see to what extent the public supports either sides of the conflict, because we've seen protests, counter-protests, so we've seen that the public opinion is a little bit split, which is not surprising because there's still a large segment of pro-Russian public, but there is also and it is a bit generational as well, but there's also a large segment that is pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic. So what I found interesting is that while support for EU and NATO membership seems to have gone up to 77% and 60% respectively, only 16% of the polled population would support military aid for Ukraine. 67% would want Bulgaria to remain so-called neutral, which means sort of not supporting its Euro-Atlantic partners de facto. And in terms of which side they would support, 21% vote to support Russia and 36% vote to support EU and NATO, and the large segment is in between, which is 43%, more than either of those two sides. So, and then the third question asked was, should Bulgaria be supported by the EU in the following crisis, energy, economic, and otherwise, that would follow from this war? And of course there we have a large segment of the population that thinks that the EU should support Bulgaria, but then there is sort of a missing link here where the population seems to think that EU-NATO membership should be there in terms of support for the country, but that shouldn't mean that we're obliged to stand by the allies in terms of military and strategic action, which is a bit conflictual. So this is the interesting sort of hybrid of Bulgaria being stuck between the West and the East, and it hasn't obstructed any military exercises, etc. On the contrary, it's has a very strategic position right at the Black Sea. So troops from the UK, the US, Spain, in general NATO troops have been stationed there for a while, and it's in support of that, battle groups are being formed. On the other hand, a lot of the pro-Russian political parties and movements and pundits that have spoken out on media, and media is a really strong opinion shaper in Bulgaria. Media and social media are, in my opinion, the strongest opinion shapers. So it seems like the narrative of, if we give military aid to Ukraine, we're jumping into the war with them, has worked, because this is sort of my conclusion of these public opinion polls, because the 67% is a very strong opinion on we should stay neutral, as compared to how many people, or what percentage of the polled would support Russia versus NATO. So it seems that this, and it is a very erroneous narrative and misleading narrative, but the public is perhaps not well enough politically informed to know that this is erroneous. So it's something that's being passed on as the truth, and it seems to me like it's working in convincing the population that if we send, for example, there's one of the things we want to send is helmets and bulletproof vests. So it seems to be the opinion is that if we send a bit of those, then we're joining the war, which is a bit ridiculous. But it seems that the pundits and this narrative, which is, from my view, based on more on financial interests than on ideology, which is how it's portrayed, that this is a Slavic country and we shouldn't enter into war with another Slavic, again, or Christian Orthodox, all of these sort of populist arguments made. The other argument made both by the defense minister and our president, who's trying to take a stronger role in the governance of the country, is that we don't have much to give. And this is where I wanted to make another point, which is there's a very sort of concrete information on this, because there is a type of ammunition from the Warsaw Pact era, from the Soviet era, that is compatible with the Ukrainian army's arsenal, and this is something that Bulgaria produces a lot of. In fact, from what I found, it's the biggest producer of this type of ammunition. So it is something very tangible and concrete that could be offered to the Ukrainian army, which is not produced anymore by that many other countries because it's obsolete, because now we're, through NATO, armament is being consolidated around a different center. So a lot of this ammunition and anti-aircraft equipment, for example, Slovakia just donated all of their, it's called C-300, it's an anti-aircraft machinery. So Slovakia donated all of that to Ukraine. And Bulgaria has some of those and said, oh, okay, we have a deficit, so we cannot. So there's a bit of a confusing narrative here where the defense minister, for example, said we don't have much to give, but then it surfaces out that we have this type of ammunition, this type of anti-aircraft machinery that is a very tangible thing that could be provided as well. Like I mentioned, helmets, bulletproof vests are concrete, even if small-scale things. But so the deputy defense minister says we should do it, and the defense minister says no, but we don't have much to give. So in a way, there's all these different elements that I described, the political schizophrenia, perhaps, of the different parties, very different views, and they have coalition councils now every day discussing all of these very different issues on which they're all divided. There's the public opinion element, where it seems to be, and by the way, the polls show that Bulgaria is very much in support of Ukrainian refugees coming to the country, and a lot of them are passing only transit, but still the opinion there is quite positive, so it's not an anti-Ukrainian sentiment at all. It's more this understanding that we might be joining the war if we support Ukraine. So all of these, and lastly, actually, there's two more incidents that are quite key for me. One is that there are two ships with Bulgarian crews stuck in the in Ukrainian seas that the government has been conducting communication and negotiations on trying to. They're not military ships. They're it's not being said, but I imagine it's trade or commercial ships that are being stuck there under Maltese flag, but with Bulgarian crew on them. So this is something also that is perhaps a reason for a bit of being more cautious and doubtful. And the other element is that the Russian ambassador to Bulgaria made some very strong controversial statements in the public space that called for her being perhaps sent back to Russia, but then this would be the end of diplomatic relations in the middle of a war, because normally you could ask for another ambassador, but in wartime that's much more complicated. So there are all these small, there were two Russian spies also found in the Bulgarian intelligence service that were recalled. All of these small elements also confuse further the situation, but mainly I would say it's the political crisis that causes this confusion on where we stand, and then there's the public opinion being split and being sort of easily confused by this various opposing narratives that shape this confusion, and unfortunately I don't see that it will be resolved anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers once again. So we have concluded the initial round of remarks, and we are more than happy to take any questions, comments, disagreements. I see there are some already coming in the chat. If I may just add one more request, and that is if you can address the questions, comments specifically to one of the speakers, or if you want more speakers or all of the speakers to answer your question, that would be appreciated. So there is one question which is not, as far as I can say, related to any of the specific countries, so I dare to leave it at this point behind. In case there will be no other questions, we will deal with the EU as such and the measures it has taken against Russia. We would like to keep the discussion really focused on either the countries that were covered or at least on the neighboring countries or on the regions, because that's where our speakers have the expertise. Of course, if we can and want to venture elsewhere, we can do it. But otherwise, try to keep your questions focused on the countries which were covered. So I'm opening the floor. Before somebody is brave enough to ask a question, let me put forward one general question to all of the speakers to think about. Some of you have already kind of tackled this, at least for some of the internal factors. But if you had, let's say, a crystal ball, what would be your prediction for the causes of a fundamental shift in the position of your country to the conflict in any way, regarding military aid, refugees, sanctions, anything you can imagine? Some of you have mentioned domestic politics, so if you want internal factors and that elections are coming up. Anything else, let's say internally and externally, meaning if there are, for example, some implicit or perhaps even explicit red lines vis-à-vis the conflict itself. So if there was a use of weapons of mass destruction or anything that has been discussed in the country. So basically, can you imagine a fundamental change in the current policy that you've discussed, and what would be the driving forces behind that change? So this is my question to all of the speakers. And any questions from the audience? Please don't hesitate. So I see Michal. You already have the mic. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of these great presentations. I've got a few questions to, I guess, all of you guys, but you can, choose to answer whatever you want. I'll start with Ricardo. Ricardo, so you said there's going to be the upcoming election, right? And but I was just wondering, like you said that majority of Americans support some form of support for Ukraine, right? So I guess the public debate is pro-Ukraine in this, and very much so. Has this helped Biden? Because before that he's been going through quite a rough patch, right? Like for at least a year with him failing to pass all these Build Back Betters or the other plans for that. So do you think that the war has helped him? This is just a question for you, Mats. You were saying something about the discussion about NATO membership in Finland is actually a lot of in favor of joining, right? If I get it right. Are the people in Finland afraid the scenario like Ukraine is going to happen in Finland as well? Especially in that period before they actually join NATO? I think it could be few years, right? It could be 3 years or so. No? Maybe more. Okay. Get to it. Christine, for you my question is, so you think that if there was a government or a capable government, it could instill some sort of identity even towards the people, right? So if there wasn't government, it would say we support Ukraine. Do you think that more people would be in favor of supporting Ukraine or vice versa? Because you said that a lot of what's happening right now is because of the sort of failed political whatever elections or the snap elections that were going through it last year. Marko, for you, there's no discussion about Serbia joining NATO, right? There's nothing like that. Do you think, is there something like that happening in countries around Serbia? Okay, that's as far as I'm interested.
So let's keep the other questions for the next round. So if we can go perhaps in the reverse order, if Marko doesn't mind starting.
You want me to answer your question first, or? And then, okay. So it's out of question, definitely. So because of the war in 1999, there is no way that Serbia will ever maybe join NATO. This is something which is well known. There is no relevant political party having this as an option. So it's a military neutrality. a sort of political as well, as we can see now in the context of the war. So this is something that is not an issue. Other states, they are already in NATO, actually, all of them, except Bosnia. Yes, as far as, yes. So it was a big issue in Montenegro because, you know, there is a big Serbian population, 33% or more Serbs actually there. They opposed Montenegro joining the European Union, or the NATO actually. And there was even alleged coup actually in 2006 on the election day organized by the Serbian and Russian secret services. And some people were actually arrested and jailed and trialed by the authorities because Russia tried to prevent Montenegro from getting into NATO. It failed, so the country joined NATO. So this is not such an issue. It is an issue in Bosnia, but Bosnia is, you know, deeply divided, the most problematic probably state in the Balkans. So you have one entity and two nations, Croats and Bosniaks, being in favor of that, while Serbs and Republika Srpska, they've been blocking the process. So I don't think this is not gonna happen anytime soon. I mean, the Bosnia is interesting because they cannot even agree on the issue of Ukraine, let alone such a big issue as their membership in NATO. So formally, the country doesn't have an opinion on this issue because the presidency, consisting of 3 members from each of 3 nations, has never discussed or made a decision. But the foreign affairs minister is Bosniak, who asked the ambassadors, I think in Brussels and New York, to support all those resolutions of the European Union and effectively impose sanctions, but they cannot be implemented because there was no decision of the presidency of Bosnia to implement sanctions because it is opposed by a Serbian member of the presidency. So it's even legally questionable whether Bosnia imposed sanctions or not. But we know they can never be implemented. So, for example, as far as I know, Russian planes can still fly to Bosnia because there is nobody to implement these sanctions without the decision of the presidency. So, the country is divided in many ways, including on this issue of NATO and Ukrainian crisis.
Thanks for the question. Also, it's a very good question. I would have to sort of speculate on it. That's also why I went to an opinion poll, because it's hard to get a feeling of the prevailing public opinion. It's obvious to see that you have both points of view, and you have really strong pro-Putin, not just pro-Russia, but pro-Putin groups. That is visible even on social media. But then it seems that it's a bit. It seems like the polls show that the confusion of the public opinion follows the confusion of the political opinion, so to speak. And for me, this is why this point of the poll was key. That it showed that the support for Russia is 21%, but then the support for neutrality is 67%. So this is the only really strong consensus I could find in this poll, which to me shows that it's that the narrative is working. And in general, going to war against Russia is something that Bulgarians would be very afraid of. So if they would believe this narrative to be true, then that could shift public opinion. If there was a more sort of solidified government, I would not think that that it would be completely unilateral and that it wouldn't be split, but it might be a bit more open towards military aid, because there, in general, it's not an anti-Ukraine sentiment. It's not a pro. Well, there is a bit of pro-Russia, but it's usually not. The pro-Putin segment is very small. It's more pro-Russia as we shouldn't go against the other brother nation. But yeah, perhaps it would be if there was a singular, more unified, more justified and well legitimated position. I think that the public opinion would be a little bit more consolidated and a little bit less antagonistic, which is also something I've noticed. It's quite a lot of bickering between the two sides, so I think it would make a difference. And as I said, also if anything would change, unfortunately, I don't see it really changing, because, as I said, even if the parliament is able to pass this, and which supposedly would give the mandate for the government to deliver military aid, I'm not sure that the government itself is interested. The second largest power in the government is the Socialist Party, which is adamantly against, and it has very strong financial reasons to be against anything done against Russia. So I would think, and the president is also from, at least ideologically, from that family, so I would think that they're able to somehow block it, tied up with other issues, and inaction is perhaps the final result again. Even just as a small example, even humanitarian aid was just agreed after weeks of discussion, so, and it's something that public opinion is not split on, but just reflects sort of this I don't know, dysfunctionality of the government. So I would be surprised if there's a very strong shift in, even if, I mean, I wouldn't even want to speak of nuclear weapons, but even if there is something that strongly shifts. I have been looking actually at what and Antony Blinken was in Bulgaria, and von der Leyen was in Bulgaria. I've been looking to see if some sort of Western opinion leaders are trying to do this, a bit of pushy diplomacy to get the government to change its mind. It doesn't seem to be, except for von der Leyen and Blinken, there isn't much other pressure, but I would think that this sort of pressure, especially if it's tied up to some financial injections coming from the EU, might maybe shift the cause of action, but can't be sure.
Thank you, Christine. So, Ricardo.
Thanks. So thanks for the question. So I'll touch on both of them briefly. So the first one, does this help Biden? It's hard to say. The American public is so divided in terms of its politics that, like I mentioned, so about half of Americans approve of the administration's handling of the crisis, but 40% don't. And this is going to be divided into whether they want more support or less support, right? So it is really hard to say. And to be quite honest, the sort of electoral cycle has not really kicked into gear yet. It's typically much shorter with the midterm elections. So perhaps the Democrats will find some way to leverage the administration's support for Ukraine, but can't really tell yet. Right now, I would still think that the Republicans will win both houses back. But the House and the Senate, sorry. And then the other question was if I can see a sort of major change, and that I'm clear on. I don't believe so. I think the U.S. populace is very much against involving American troops into the war, and they are also, for the most part, the memory of the Cold War is still very much in mind. So this is going to very much shape sort of public opinion within the U.S.
Okay, thank you for the two questions. I will start with Olda's question and then move on to Micha's question. And what can lead to a change? I mean, this is all about changes, right? If you would have asked me the day before Putin decided to start this war against Ukraine, if there is a chance of Sweden and Finland becoming NATO members within the foreseeable future, I would have said no. The reason being clear public opinion against NATO membership in both countries and no strong discussion on the issue. And this has all changed very quickly, of course. And if a war would end quickly, then of course that could change again. Different a little bit in the two countries. In Finland, the issue of non-alignment, neutrality, was always during the Cold War viewed as a part of a so-called Finlandization. That is, Finland did not decide voluntarily to remain neutral. It had its friendship agreement with the Soviet Union from 1948 and was efficiently prevented from a lot of international cooperation during the Cold War as a consequence. So in Finland, the non-alignment strategy was always viewed a little bit more negatively compared to Sweden, but it was viewed as a good strategy to provide for peace and security also in the period after the Cold War, meaning that Finland had relied on closer contacts with Moscow compared to Sweden, and more a strategy of staying non-aligned in peacetime in search for neutrality in case of war. But in Finland this has gradually changed more compared to Sweden. And what I would say is, then getting back to this issue a little bit of what if the war would stop tomorrow. I mean, in Sweden, the Cold War experience was viewed as highly positive of non-alignment neutrality. There was references to what is called Nordic Balance. The Nordic Balance basically said you had two of the countries, Denmark and Norway, being in NATO but without having permanent troops on their soil, foreign troops. And then you had Sweden and Finland, being Sweden completely neutral, Finland more aligned to the USSR in any case. But because these countries had so good contacts between each other, you had that as kind of providing stability, low tensions in that area. And there are a lot of people still viewing that as the best strategy in both these countries, to remain outside. And it's not a selfish strategy necessarily, but a strategy to provide for less of tensions, lower tensions. So if the war would end tomorrow, I would guess that in both countries you will have a lot of the NATO opponents getting back to saying, well, why are we doing this? Let's stay outside again. We had a good strategy going. We shouldn't change it due to some quick or some sudden events in the light of a war, in the light of a crisis. We need to stick to that. And then getting to Michal's question, well, I think there is more of a concern of an actual military threat in Finland. And obviously after filing in an application, that might increase. I don't think at this point people are really concerned that Putin would issue an invasion into Finland, but more some kind of hybrid warfare, some other kind of provocations, other kind of attacks in that way. So there are concerns about that. And for that reason, there are also preparations to say that if Finland actually will declare that they apply for NATO membership on Wednesday, which is possible, but we want to have clear security guarantees from the major powers within NATO, not only from the United States, but also from France, the United Kingdom. And I think the speed of accession can be much, much faster than the few years you mentioned. Finland has been working with the strategy of a NATO option for the last few years, meaning that the country has actually prepared its budget, prepared its defense strategy, its military equipment to be compatible with NATO. So basically everything is kind of prepared for a quick accession, and if it's a question of a number of months or approximately how long time it would take, obviously all NATO countries would have to agree to it and ratify the membership, but it's a question of quickly that could go. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So let's open the second round of questions, comments. So please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentations and for all the words you said. I've got some questions, but they are more like about people of these countries. So you mentioned Biden, who tried to describe his words that he doesn't want to change regime in Russia and other things like this. And what do people in your countries think about Zelensky's speeches? Because he doesn't choose the words like Biden. He doesn't try to explain his words like, oh no, I mean something different. He tell one thing and he want to tell this thing. The second question is, we can admit that propaganda is a really strong enemy, and it has a million of voices, and the truth has just one voice. So how can truth win propaganda? And about perception of the people, some of the countries call this, let's say, war, like a conflict, a crisis, or some of them say that it's special operation. So how do these people can describe their thoughts about first world crisis and second world conflict? Thank you.
lot of questions, so I think we can stop the second round right here, and let's go again in the reverse order. So Mats, if you want to go first.
Well, good questions. If we look at public opinion, I haven't really seen any opinion polls regarding the support for Mr. Zelensky in the Nordic countries, but he had speeches to both the Swedish parliament, the Norwegian parliament, and other parliaments as well, and received huge attention. And I think figure is quite clearly very popular, and one of the reasons why the support, probably not maybe the main reason, I wouldn't say it's linked to a person, but the support for Ukraine is very strong in all the countries. When it comes to the issue of how to combat propaganda and how to deal with providing for a discussion where you can combat disinformation, or it's of course a very difficult question. Shall we refer to more of censorship? Shall we try to prevent people from being able to access certain news servers, which has been done even at the European level to avoid Russian propaganda? Some would say that the Finnish population would be extremely good at being difficult to influence by propaganda. And what would then be the key strategy? Probably a more long-term strategy of general good education system, critical thinking, and these kind of things. It's not something that you kind of create overnight, right? It's something which takes a much longer time to establish. But that would be my brief answer to that question.
So thank you for the questions. So with regards to Biden, and it was Zelensky that you were asking about. So again, I also haven't seen too many opinion polls regarding how people feel about him, but for the most part, what I have seen is that the support is there for Zelensky as a sort of political figure. He has been in pretty close contact with both the administration and Congress, and he has received bipartisan support, which again is a pretty big deal because very few issues are bipartisan nowadays in the U.S. With regards to propaganda, I guess I'll take a different sort of view on this. So within the U.S., the sort of media environment is complex and interesting, and it's a whole mess, right? We have sort of cable news dominating the airwaves on a nightly basis. Fox News, CNN kind of seen as the sort of two sides of the spectrum. And what we've seen is a sort of shift towards seeing what sells rather than being accurate with the news. And for the most part, I think Fox News has been worse, but CNN has also fallen into the kind of category here, as we saw with the sort of fever pitch that was reached after Trump won, and then it was like they were basically discussing on a nightly basis, is this man a Russian agent, with, before letting any sort of investigation or anything else kind of come out. So the whole thing could be kind of seen as a little bit ridiculous. And so we have a real problem in the U.S. with the nature of our sort of media environment and with people sort of falling prey to unrepudiated reports and all sorts of different elements like this. In terms of how to fight that, that's kind of hard to say in the U.S. So we got rid of what was called the Fairness Doctrine, which essentially said that you have to be quite sure before you present something on TV, just to kind of simplify it a lot, back in the 80s. And that's opened up the sort of gateway for this sort of cable news media environment that I personally think is quite, it hurts the country in a certain sense. Thank you.
So I would actually join Ricardo on the last point. And I find that the Bulgarian media landscape looks very similar to the US one. Not for the good, rather exactly the issues that he described, the sensationalization of news, the jumping on board of whatever causes the most clicks, and that splits as well public opinion, and that is makes the public opinion very vulnerable to fake news, to propaganda. It actually happened with, like I mentioned, the 2 ships stuck in Ukraine. There was within 1 week 3 types of fake news spread that it's being bombed, that the crew is being taken hostage. So every day the crew had to actually report on news directly to disprove this narrative coming from the propaganda machines. Unfortunately, Bulgarian public is very vulnerable to that, and opinion shifts very easily and very quickly. There was also you said the operation versus war. Our defense minister was very quickly fired when he called it a military operation. But then again, he is one of the people representing that point of view. But that sort of shows, to go to your point about support of Ukraine in general, that sort of goes to show that even people that don't support military aid for Ukraine still rather support the Ukrainian cause, because people were more or less saying this is unacceptable. We can't just take the side of a aggressive dictator. We have to somehow be have a bit more solidarity. So yeah, on propaganda versus truth, it's not a question we can answer here. Certainly people have been trying to deal with that for a couple of decades, specifically dealing with Russian propaganda, and Balkan countries, Eastern European countries are specifically a target for that. It's been claimed also that the Putin regime has supported certain far-right parties in these countries to disintegrate unity of not only public opinion, but also for this argument of denazification. So you see these far-right parties developing again in Europe, and this drives this narrative of that. The perception of Zelensky is a bit of another issue, and I also don't have concrete poll results, but my feeling is that there is a bit more of a division there. He is, whereas I feel in the Western sphere there's quite a positive perception of him. In the Bulgarian public space, I feel like there's a bit of again, to this argument of neutrality, I feel like he's seen as a bit of a provocator to escalation further of the conflict beyond Ukraine. So some people are saying maybe we should try to sort of limit or put out the fire before it spreads further to the region. It's definitely not a one-sided. It's sort of split, but I've seen both emerging. So that's it.
So I have some public opinion data published on Friday, actually, when it comes to Serbian public opinion. So 64% of people there support EU membership, but actually only 21% of people said that they have a positive view of the European Union. At the same time, in Albania, for example, 77 support memberships, in Macedonia 74, in Montenegro 90% of people support EU membership. So you can see a clear distinction between traditionally anti-European, I would say, not even hard Eurosceptic population in Serbia compared to its neighbors which are not in the EU, and the fact that people do not have positive view of the EU at all, but they do support to some extent membership, so have the kind of utilitarian approach to EU and the membership, which is linked to the fact that they have positive attitudes towards Russia, 63%, and China, 65%, while only 8% of people had positive attitudes towards the United States, for example. So there is a clear discrepancy between different countries and different states. When it comes to Ukraine, this is something that was interesting. So 21% said that Serbia should clearly and loudly side with Russia. 21, so not very high number. 13, Serbia should clearly and loudly side with the EU and Ukraine. But 50% said in March, so that was after the start of this aggression of Ukraine of Russia, that Serbia should stay neutral, even at the cost of sanctions imposed by the West, shortages, and everything reminiscent of the 1990s when the sanctions were imposed on Serbia. So you can see actually, I would say this is some kind of muted Russophilia visible, despite the fact that you have only 21 saying we should clearly side with Russia. You have 50 being ready to pay a significant price, meaning being sanctioned eventually for not siding with the West, just not to impose sanctions on Russia, for example. Regarding the media is largely pro-Russian. There are like just 2 independent TV stations, for example, in the country. Sputnik is very influential. It hasn't in Serbian language. It hasn't been banned. Spreading Kremlin disinformation. And what is interesting, Russian sources are seen as legitimate, widely used, shared. So nobody, asks questions of what kind of source is coming from a country that is, brutal, increasingly brutal authoritarian system. And then you can see this space given to pro-Russian think tanks, organizations, institutes, research institutes. There is a number of far-right movements, groups, including, for example, football fans. They tend to be very nationalist and pro-Russian. So we can see that very few people showed up when there was a rally in support of Ukraine. But I think Serbia was the only country where there was quite a big rally of people supporting Russia quite early after the start of the so this was like a couple of weeks after the start of this aggression, when the whole world was in shock. There were thousands of people clearly supporting Russia, and very few of them showing support to Ukraine when there was a rally. I didn't answer your question with regards to what may change the position of Serbia and maybe eventually imposing sanctions on Russia. I would say it depends on president that I explained earlier and his kind of perceptions and whether they've been. So he's essentially a pragmatist who will simply analyze the situation, and eventually, if he assesses that the potential economic consequences of not siding with the West would be significant, he would probably, that would harm his public standing, and he would probably impose at least some symbolic sanctions, because that's the issue in Serbia, nothing else. So he even said something like a few days ago, I ask people to understand that if we have sanctions of the West imposed on Serbia for not siding with them, we will have nothing to eat. He will portray this as unbearable pressure that he cannot, stand anymore, that Serbia would be forced to do that, because he even said on Thursday there was a NATO fighter flew near an Air Serbia flight to Moscow, from Belgrade to Moscow, and that's the incident reflecting the growing pressure on Serbia over its stand on Russia and the war in Ukraine. And one interesting number as well, 49% of voters of his own party, Serbian Progressive Party, would like Serbia to join the European Union. So this is something that he cannot ignore. Actually, this is quite a significant number of people saying, for example, a few days ago, we are a military neutral state, but we are not a politically neutral state. We are on the European path. As long as we are on the European path, we cannot be politically neutral. So you can see this kind of gradual preparation of public for possible shift in this long-standing policy towards Russia, but I'm not sure whether this is really going to happen, because that would be a really big change, big shift. Another thing that may change the dynamics is if the EU becomes serious about these countries joining the EU. So now they have this opportunity, a window of opportunity to do something about it. This is quite interesting because, probably you know more about it. Romania and Bulgaria, there was a political decision for them to be accepted as a consequence of the war in Kosovo in 1999. So I think now the Western Balkan states can use this opportunity to do something about to seize the opportunity and do something about their potential membership in the EU, because this is not the same, world anymore. For example, Ursula von der Leyen was in Sofia last Thursday, I think. Yes, this is what she said. Nothing will be the same as before the war in Ukraine. So it was important for the EU to fulfill the promise to the neighbors, meaning mostly Macedonia and Albania, and to start negotiations with them, because I mean, it really now looks totally irrelevant, you know, the issue of, you know, how to title the language spoken in North Macedonia, or whether those that fought Ottomans 100 years ago in Macedonia were predominantly Macedonian or Bulgarian. And these were the issues why Bulgaria blocked Macedonia. And your prime minister actually said that this is going to change, that you know, that this process must begin for Macedonia and Albania and accelerate in the next couple of weeks, because the Western Balkans must take the path to the EU accession as soon as possible. So they're probably willing now to not to block Macedonia anymore, to start negotiations, and probably hopefully to speed up negotiations with Serbia and Montenegro, given that they cannot, you know, allow having this kind of a hole in the middle of the EU that can be and is obviously being misused by the Russians, given the certain new circumstances in Europe. So that will be a final, probably a push towards that can force Serbs to kind of finally choose, if they realize that there is a credible membership on the EU part, because there has never been credible membership, despite the fact that some of these countries have been negotiating membership for almost 10 years.
Thank you very much. We are slowly but surely running out of time, but I know there are a few more questions, so let's take the last round of questions. So please go ahead. And then
I have a question to Marko. Can we say that Montenegro's public opinion is as much as pro-Russian as the Serbian one, despite the fact that Montenegro is a member of NATO?
Let's take the last question, unless there are more. And then we will go for the answers.
The questions predominantly to Marko. It seems that the decision to move closer to the European Union was very much based on pragmatic calculation, and also on some kind of notion that the EU is predominantly political and economic project. But the Ukrainian crisis is probably changing the very identity of the European Union, because the European Union explicitly said, okay, we will fund arms going to Ukraine. Also, Putin is increasingly viewing the European Union as a geopolitical competitor. We saw it in 2014 already, when we suddenly realized that we are being perceived as a geopolitical competitor, and the innocent step of offering trade agreement to Ukraine annoyed Putin. So my question is, would that kind of change in the identity of the EU, becoming more a military actor, or being perceived more as a military actor, change the opinion of politicians and, you know, even the electorate in Serbia? Also, another context, just recently Scholz declared that the EU is about mutual assistance. He said it openly, to some extent in order to allay some of the fears of the Scandinavian countries. So this also adds to the mosaic that the EU is also, you know, stressing its nature, that it is actually an alliance, including a military alliance. So how would Serbia be comfortable in that type of the European Union? And the last question, if I may allow quickly, a question to Kristina and also Marko regarding the pro-Russian parts of society are very much based, I'm talking about the far right, it's very much based on the perception of Putin as a strongman, as a winner who is able to be tough on the West. What if he loses in Ukraine? How that would change the attitude towards Russia?
So let's start with Christine, if I may.
Thank you. Interesting. Haven't really thought about it, but I guess that might change the narrative at least a little bit, because again, I think the pro-Russian and pro-Putin demographics don't necessarily overlap. There is some overlap, but there's a much larger pro-Russian community than a pro-Putin community. The pro-Putin one, I definitely get the feeling of exactly what you described. It's this the strong man that wins, that is not afraid of I don't know, these boring politicians from Brussels. He just goes and takes what he wants. This hero, this, like, you see these memes of him as a hero, and which is also interesting because these far-right groups, and especially the one in Bulgaria, which is rather new, it's a far-right group that's very pro-Putin, which to me makes no sense, other than they have some financial common ties. Our national day is 3rd of March, so they organized a rally on the hills where Bulgaria was liberated from the Ottomans, a pro-Russian rally in support of Russia against Ukraine, which was a very bizarre thing to have happened, if only it didn't seem so obvious that that's somehow related to the this propaganda machine working somehow in Bulgaria. Whether that would change, hopefully Putin is somehow already losing ground. Maybe that we can see already that it shifts opinion. I would hope it does, but yeah, I would have to speculate. In terms of also what you said about the EU, well, that's also a narrative that, because EU is more my topic actually, so it's interesting because the US tried to stay away from calling itself a military or defense alliance, because that's NATO's territory, so it's trying not to step on NATO's toes and not to annoy countries including Russia. So that's sort of, it seems to sort of tiptoe around the line depending on also opportunistically what fits better, but normally it's much more about industrial defense cooperation than territorial defense, because this is really left out of the discussion to be left to NATO's devices. And at least in, I don't know about the rest of the Balkans, but in Bulgaria it's definitely seen as that's not really the EU's job. But on the other hand, it's very opportunistic, because it seems like Bulgaria still doesn't get the security, what the security guarantee means. It means someone attacks Bulgaria, the NATO steps in, but also the strategic location at the Black Sea is the reason for Bulgaria to be a member of NATO, because the Western partners need that for geostrategical reasons and exactly the potentiality of this conflict. So there's a bit of a schizophrenia there between the two sides of public opinion. Sorry, it took a bit.
So this is, I mean, very interesting question. So regarding Putin, I hope that he's going to lose war in Ukraine. But even if that happens, the crucial will be how that will be portrayed by Russian propaganda in general in Serbia, of course, and anywhere else. So it wouldn't be actually so crucial what actually happened, but how that is going to be presented. And I don't think that that's going to have any negative impact on him. He will still would be seen as a strong man. Just to give you an example, a few days ago I was talking to my father, who is unfortunately quite pro-Putin, so we have a big issue in the family, and in many families, I guess. And I told him, so you see, your guy is losing the war in Ukraine. And he said, you have no idea about military, strategy. So, he did this on purpose, and, he's not gonna lose the war. And you will always find this kind of justification, not accepting the reality, because he heard that probably somewhere on Sputnik or somewhere, saying this was a kind of strategic decision to move away. And now, because we didn't want, of course, to change the government in Kiev, we didn't want Ukraine to be part of the Russian Empire. We just wanted to kind of take Donbas And that came to our mind like a month after, when we were actually defeated. So the idea, crucial will be how they will present this in the media, and I'm sure that these people are going to buy it into this anyway, because this is so deep, this kind of so deep engraved pro-Putin sentiments that no matter what, they will just follow him. That's my impression. I mean, I can see from the rhetoric of my own father. Regarding the EU becoming a military alliance, that could be another problem. That could be another obstacle for Serbia joining the EU eventually, because that would be just another Western kind of style military alliance that, given how NATO is unpopular in Serbia, that would probably create problems for Serbia and Bosnia, because of the Serbs in Bosnia. They just resolutely reject the membership in NATO. So that may be replicated onto the EU, but hopefully this is not going to happen. But certainly that would create another issue, another problems, because currently the EU is seen as more normative power, neutral terms, the same as in Bulgaria, not in this way. People don't know much about common security defense policy. They don't perceive that as important, or it's an economic, not even political and economic phenomena. When it comes to Montenegro, its country is obviously divided, as well as many European countries, but it has a very large Serbian population of maybe 1/3, and then many Montenegrins also consider themselves to be Serbs at the same time. So it's very difficult, to differentiate between the two. So they've been all traditionally sympathetic to Russia. Russia is a major investor in Montenegro. Many Russian tycoons, they have properties in yachts in Montenegro. So all that shows how difficult it was for Montenegrin government to impose sanctions on Russia. It took them a month to do that. And apparently they did that on April the 8th. They adopted a decision on anti-Russian sanctions from the third attempt, but unspecified sanctions. So we still don't know what actually they adopted. The problem is that the government is caretaker government, and it's deeply divided, consisting of liberal, pro-Montenegrin centrist groups, pro-Serbian influenced by Vučić, and pro-Serbian not influenced by Vučić. So it's a quite mix of different perceptions and different ideologies, making things very different for a caretaker government to make a decision. So they finally did it a month later, but still we don't know actually what exactly, whether they accepted all the sanctions, just aligned themselves with the EU, or just decided to choose some of the sanctions. Mostly because many people are opposed. Some of the parties in the government were actually opposed, but there was a majority. Apparently, there was even a physical conflict between two ministers not agreeing on this issue a few weeks ago, indicating how important this is, and emotional also, not only rational. Thank you.
Mats wants to join in the discussion, so.
It's only because I always want to have a last word. No, but I just wanted to make one reflection upon Vite's comment. And basically, the fact that the EU as an international actor is changing is also reflected in what I mentioned a little bit before. But for instance, in Norway, there has been the idea that you can have economic benefits of EU membership without being a member of organization through the European Economic Area, and now you have a discussion again that maybe Norway should enter the European Union to be a part of this decision-making body when it comes to activities, external activities, sanctions, but also when it comes to the common security and defense policy, where Norway actually is participating already very heavily. And on the other hand, to Denmark, which is already a member of the European Union, but with this exception for the common security and defense policy, you will have a referendum on actually becoming a part of that, which is kind of also an acknowledgement here, but it's becoming more important, that this aspect of the European Union is becoming more important. So basically, just to make one final word, which is not affecting any of the countries that we are talking about today, but this, of course, will have an effect on the United Kingdom as well, and its exit. that maybe this would just imply that the exit means different things than initially considered. Okay, I will not speak anymore. Thanks.
Thank you, Mats. I will take the last word anyway, so don't worry. I would like to thank all of you who came today, especially our speakers, for sharing their comments and insights into their native countries and the neighboring countries. Thank you for asking the questions. Those of you who are online, thank you for being with us at least online. I also know that there will be another event on the war in Ukraine, sort of along the lines of the national perspectives, focusing on the Middle East and African countries. So I don't know when exactly that will be taking place, but the announcement will be made soon. So thank you all for coming, and see you at future events at MUP.